It rests under a soft, low light, a single tablet of baked clay from the ruins of Ur, 4,000 years old. Its surface is a dense grid of tiny, wedge-shaped marks, a language that has been silent for millennia. Most of its text is administrative, a meticulous accounting of a world that believed in order. But near the end of the city's life, the accounting changes. One line, translated from the cuneiform, records a new kind of inventory. It does not list jars of oil or bushels of grain. It simply states, "In its fields, where the fine herbs grew, the withering plant now grew." This is not an observation about a poor harvest. It is a statement about a fundamental alteration of the earth itself. The tablet is catalogued as part of a larger composition, the lament for the destruction of Ur. The date assigned to the event it describes is precise, circa 2004 BCE. This was the final breath of the Sumerian world, the end of the third dynasty of Ur, a civilization built on predictability, on the cycles of the rivers, on the unwavering belief that meticulous records could hold chaos at bay. The scribe who pressed these marks into the wet clay was not a poet attempting to capture emotion. He was a functionary of the state, a bureaucrat documenting the collapse of a system. His language is stark, repetitive, and devoid of overt grief. He is simply taking stock of a world that no longer functions. The precision of the language is what first creates the disturbance. A withering plant is not a metaphor for sadness. It is a specific term for something that now grows where food once did. The lament continues, noting that in the city's once teeming canals, where fish would dart through the water, a mountain thorn now grew. These are not the words of a civilization defeated in conventional warfare. Armies burn cities and salt fields, but they do not rewrite the biological code of the landscape. This is a record of an ecological transformation, sudden and absolute. It is the first hint that the category of lament might be a mistranslation of a far colder document. A damage report. If this is the kind of question that holds you here, in the quiet, consider subscribing. It ensures you are present when the next archive is opened. For a moment, you can almost feel the silence of the room it was found in. The dust of southern Mesopotamia, suspended in the air. The weight of 4,000 winters pressing down on this small, fired object. The scribes of Ur believed their world was eternal, a perfect reflection of a divine order. They recorded every transaction, every royal decree, every omen, believing that to write something down was to give it a permanent place in the structure of reality. They were masters of documentation. But that is precisely what makes the nature of this final document so unsettling. It is an account of reality itself coming undone, recorded with the same dispassionate clarity used to track shipments of wool. And this record is not an anomaly. It is a pattern. As archaeologists brushed the dust from the libraries of other fallen Sumerian cities, Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, they found similar texts. Each city had its own lament, its own meticulous catalogue of an unnatural end. And in these texts, a name for the cause begins to emerge. It was not an army of Elamites or Amorites, though they were enemies of Ur. The records attribute the devastation to a specific phenomenon, a singular agent of destruction. They called it the Imhulu, the evil wind. To remain here with these fragments is to acknowledge a certain kind of silence. It is to recognize a question that has been waiting in the archives, largely unasked. There are those who keep watch over such records, not to find easy answers, but simply to ensure the trail does not go completely cold. They understand that some histories are not found in the grand narratives of kings and battles, but in the quiet, persistent contradictions buried in the administrative texts of a world that vanished too quickly. The scribes describe this wind with a strange, technical precision that defies meteorological explanation. It was born in the west. It covered the land like a cloak, and was followed by a scorching heat. The texts report that this wind made the water in the rivers bitter and undrinkable, that it silenced the city, leaving no voices in the streets. It was a force that did not simply pass through. It settled upon the landscape, rendering it sterile for a long time to come. This is not the description of a sandstorm, nor a fire, nor a flood. It is the description of an agent whose properties do not align with the natural or technological world of the Bronze Age. And here, the true antagonist of this history first appears. It is not the wind itself, but a profound and pervasive void in the records. The archives of the Third Dynasty of Ur are among the most complete in the ancient world. We have tablets detailing legal disputes, grain distribution, and diplomatic correspondence. The scribes recorded everything. Yet in the years leading up to 2004 BCE, there is no mention of a military buildup by an enemy capable of this level of absolute destruction. There are no records of a siege that could turn the very soil to poison. The administrative continuity of Ur simply stops. The last economic tablet is written, filed away, and the next text to emerge from the silence is the lament. The question, then, is not what destroyed Ur. The scribes give us an answer. A decision was made by the gods, and the evil wind was the result. The true question, the one that lingers in the low light of the archive, is why a civilization of obsessive record-keepers chose to document a physical, observable, and catastrophic event in this way. Why describe an environmental collapse with the language of a bureaucratic report while attributing its ultimate cause to a remote administrative decision made in a divine assembly? It is a record of an event whose effects were meticulously observed, but whose nature was fundamentally incomprehensible. The formula repeats. Across the tablets recovered from the ruins of Ur, the lament begins not with a cry of grief, but with an inventory. The scribe lists the temples, one by one, and notes their new condition. Its rites have been destroyed, he writes. Its divine regulations have been forgotten. He notes that in the great house of the goddess Ningal, no food is offered. In the shrine of Nana, no songs are sung. This is not poetry. It is the first section of a damage report, an accounting of divine services that have been suspended indefinitely. The gods have been vacated from their residences. The inventory then moves from the sacred to the civic. The scribe records the state of the city's public life with the same dispassionate precision. In its assembly places, where the country once gathered, the people are no more. He notes the silence of the city gates, the emptiness of the wide avenues once filled with festive crowds. He observes that the sounds of music and the voices of herdsmen have ceased. Each observation is a line item, a confirmation that a fundamental system of urban life has been shut down. The city is no longer a living entity. It is a collection of non-functioning components. From the social, the record proceeds to the economic. The scribe documents the collapse of the state's infrastructure. In its granaries, once overflowing, dust accumulates. He records that the ships that brought goods to the quays of Ur are gone. The barges on the canals are untethered and drift aimlessly. The pens for the sheep and cattle stand empty. This is the final confirmation of systemic failure. The flow of goods, the management of resources, the very mechanisms that defined the Sumerian state have ceased to operate. The scribe is not mourning a culture. He is auditing a failed administration. And then, the record gives a name to the agent of this failure. It is not an army, nor a flood, nor a famine in the conventional sense. The tablets state that the gods, in their assembly, unleashed the Imhulu, the evil wind. This is not presented as a metaphor. It is designated as the official instrument of the city's end, a specific phenomenon deployed to execute a decision. The term appears in the administrative language of the lament, as a cause for the effects that are being so meticulously catalogued. The record provides a vector for this agent. It was born in the West. This detail, repeated in the texts, transforms the wind from a random act of nature into a phenomenon with a point of origin and a deliberate trajectory. A storm can come from any direction, but this force is given a specific, recorded source. It moved from a designated place toward its target. The scribe is not just noting a catastrophe. He is documenting its operational parameters, as he would the route of a royal procession or a trade caravan. The physical behavior of the imhalu is described with a strange objectivity. The texts say it covered the land like a cloak. This is not the language used for a sandstorm, which scours and passes. A cloak settles, it envelops, it remains. The description implies a pervasive, lingering presence, a substance that did not just strike the city but occupied it. It was a condition that descended upon the landscape and stayed, changing the very nature of the environment it touched. The consequences of this occupation are recorded in the earth and water. The scribe notes that the life-giving water of the Tigris became bitter. This is not a description of water made muddy by flood or tainted by decay. It is a report of a fundamental chemical alteration, a change in the water's essential quality, rendering it undrinkable and hostile to life. An entire river system, the foundation of Sumerian civilization, was documented as having been poisoned at its source. The record of the soil is just as precise. Where fine herbs grew, the withering plant now grew. This is not a report of a failed harvest due to drought or blight. It is a statement of ecological replacement. One form of life, which sustained the city, has been systematically supplanted by another form of life that signifies sterility. The scribe is documenting a biological event, a permanent alteration of the agricultural landscape. The very ground had been reprogrammed to produce not sustenance, but its opposite. This pattern of biological inversion continues in the waterways. In its rivers, where the fish would dart, the scribe writes, the mountain thorn now grew. The image is stark and physically incongruous. A thorny terrestrial plant flourishing in a riverbed where aquatic life once thrived. This detail, so specific and unnatural, serves as another cold data point. The rules of the natural world have been suspended. The agent of destruction did not just kill, it rewrote the biological code of the region. The human cost is recorded with the same forensic detachment. The city was made into a ruin. Its people, not potsherds, littered its sides. The scribe equates the bodies of the dead with broken pottery, scattered debris to be accounted for in the aftermath. There is no language of suffering, no description of battle or heroic defense. There is only the final state of the population, observed and noted as another piece of evidence in the comprehensive ruin of the city. In later traditions that inherited these accounts, like the Akkadian-era epos, a more technical detail of this human toll is preserved. The texts describe a force that caused bodies to dissolve, to lose their coherence. It speaks of a death that was not inflicted by a blade or a blunt instrument, but by an environmental condition that unmade the physical form itself. This is not a record of slaughter. It is a record of disintegration. Perhaps, in the quiet of this moment, you can notice the time. Record it. It is the time that this particular file was reopened, its silence disturbed after millennia. A simple act of observation, mirroring that of the scribe. The silence itself is a recurring line item in the report. In its streets, where the festive crowds had thronged, there was now only silence. The absence of sound is treated as a measurable, defining characteristic of the aftermath. For a civilization built on the sounds of the temple, the market, and the workshop, this absolute quiet was not merely an emotional state. It was a data point signifying the complete cessation of all civic and religious functions. The city's vital signs had flatlined. The structural damage reported in related texts points to forces beyond the means of any Bronze Age army. The era epos speaks of a scorching heat that accompanied the wind. It describes a power that could turn the interior of the city into baked clay. This is not the language of a fire set by invaders, which leaves behind charcoal and ash. This is the language of immense, Transformative heat, a thermal event capable of vitrifying earth and brick on a massive scale. This destructive force is described as being both absolute and strangely discriminate. The records differentiate between the fates of different areas and different people. The devastation, while total within its zone of impact, appears geographically contained. It does not describe a spreading fire or a regional flood, but a power that could be applied with a degree of precision, annihilating one location while leaving another untouched. This suggests a mechanism of destruction far more complex than simple, overwhelming force. The scribe offers only one ultimate cause for this sequence of impossible events. The decision was made in the divine assembly. Anu, the king of the gods, had uttered his word. Enlil, the lord of all lands, had decreed the fate. This is not presented as an emotional outburst of a wrathful deity. It is framed as a formal decree, an executive order from a remote and hierarchical authority. The cataclysm is simply the execution of a sentence that has been passed down. The state of the land after the event is not one of recovery. It is one of lasting contamination. The laments do not speak of rebuilding. They speak of a land that has become unclean, a place that cannot be inhabited. The destruction was not a temporary setback to be overcome, but a permanent state change. The city and its surrounding fields were not just conquered. They were rendered fundamentally unusable for an extended period of time. This was not the report of a single, isolated event. The lament for Eridu contains a similar catalogue of unnatural devastation. The lament for Nippur follows the same formulaic structure. The scribes of different cities, faced with the same phenomenon, used the same standardized administrative language to document it. This was not a unique local tragedy. It was a recurring regional event, reported in a consistent format across southern Mesopotamia. The final record is the void itself. The archives of the Third Dynasty of Ur are filled with thousands of tablets detailing the day-to-day operations of a complex bureaucracy, right up to the final years. A tablet records the receipt of taxes. Another details a legal contract. The next tablet to be written, after a short, undocumented gap, is the lament. The administrative continuity of 1,000 years simply stops. Between the last mundane transaction and the report on the end of the world, there is only silence. The work is slow, methodical. It is done under a low, steady light that casts no hard shadows. On a wide, dark table, 2 tablets are placed side by side. One is from the archives of Ur, the other from the excavated library of Eridu, miles to the south. The hands of the researcher, careful and patient, align them. The clay is of a different color, the script of a slightly different hand, yet the structure is the same. It is the first jarring recognition, not of a similar story, but of a shared architecture, a template. The eye is drawn from one to the other, a slow comparison of the wedge-shaped marks. The opening lines of the laments, though separated by geography and the specific patron deities of each city, follow an identical formulaic sequence. The scribe of Ur writes, "Its rights have been destroyed." The scribe of Eridu, in his own lament, writes the same. The litany of suspended services, of abandoned shrines, of silenced rituals, is not a unique outpouring of grief. It is a standardized report, a checklist of systemic failures, filled out in duplicate. This realization alters the gravity of the documents. A single poem can be interpreted as a metaphor, an artistic rendering of a tragic defeat. But a form, a bureaucratic template for catastrophe, implies something else. It suggests a procedure. It suggests that the event being recorded was of a specific, recognizable type, one for which a standardized reporting structure had been established. This is the language of an administration documenting a recurring operational problem, not the language of a people mourning a singular, unexpected loss. For a moment, the 2 tablets seem to hum with a shared, cold frequency. The precision is unnerving. It is the precision of an inventory taken after a fire, or an audit conducted on a failed enterprise. The scribes were not expressing the chaos of the moment. They were imposing order upon it, using the only tool they had, the rigid, structured language of their bureaucracy. They were filing a report on the end of their world. To remain with these records is to accept a different kind of historical inquiry. It is to understand that some events are preserved not in stories, but in spreadsheets. It is to keep watch over the data until the pattern becomes undeniable. Those who continue this work are not seeking a narrative, but a signal buried in the noise of millennia. The investigation expands. The researcher places maps of the excavation sites next to the tablets. The archaeological strata are marked with fine, precise lines. The destruction layer at Ur, dated to the end of the Third Dynasty, is a thin, dark band in the earth. That same dark band appears at Nippur. It appears again at Eridu. The textual pattern is mirrored by a geological one. The end was not a sequence of isolated events. It was a single, synchronous horizon of devastation across the Sumerian plain. The core data points within the reports remain consistent across all sites. The agent of destruction is always the Imhulu, the evil wind. Its vector is always from the west. Its effects are always the same. Water turned bitter, soil rendered sterile, the growth of a withering plant where grain once grew. Scribes in different cities, working under different kings, all recorded the exact same sequence of anomalous ecological events. The testimonies are independent, yet they are identical. The implication is inescapable. This was not a series of local misfortunes. It was a regional cataclysm, a single, sweeping event that simultaneously struck the major urban centers of southern Mesopotamia, leaving the same unnatural signature upon the land in each location. The laments are not separate stories of fallen cities. They are corroborating field reports from different observation posts, all describing the same vast and incomprehensible phenomenon. The scale of the event settles into the silence of the room. This is no longer the history of a single city's fall. It is the fossil record of a civilization's instantaneous collapse. The dust that fills the cuneiform grooves seems to carry a different weight now, not the simple dust of ages, but the residual fallout of a single, coordinated termination. The inquiry narrows, focusing on a specific detail from the later Akkadian syntheses, the scorching heat. The researcher pulls up soil analysis reports from the original digs. Buried in the technical language are recurring observations. Pockets of vitrified brick at the base of the ziggurat at Ur. Sand fused into glass-like sheets in the destruction layer of Nippur. These are not the remnants of a conventional fire. This evidence of extreme thermal events is not widespread, like the ash layer from a city put to the torch. It is concentrated, localized. It appears in the same archaeological stratum as the final administrative tablets, a physical confirmation of a thermal event far exceeding the capabilities of any Bronze Age incendiary. It is the physical scar left by the scorching heat described in the texts. The pattern now connects the textual record to the geological one. The scribe's account of a wind that poisons and a heat that melts is validated by the physical evidence of sterile soil and vitrified earth. The two datasets, one written in clay and the other in the ground itself, align perfectly. They describe a weapon, or an event, that combined a lasting radiological or chemical contamination with an intense, directed thermal energy. A deep sense of dislocation sets in. The world of Sumer, of reed boats on the Euphrates, of barley harvests and temple hymns, feels impossibly distant from the world described in its own final reports. The two cannot coexist in the same historical moment. The friction between what was technologically possible and what was meticulously recorded is the central feature of this entire mystery. The researcher now turns to the final, and perhaps most significant, piece of evidence: the void. A timeline is laid out, constructed from the dating of thousands of administrative tablets. For the city of Ur, it shows a dense, unbroken line of record-keeping. The daily, mundane business of a complex state, documented with obsessive care. Then, precisely in 2004 BCE, the line stops. This abrupt cessation is not unique to Ur. The archives of Nippur show the same pattern. The records of Eridu follow the same trajectory. A functioning, literate, and highly organized bureaucracy is documenting tax receipts one day, and the next, it is gone. There are no records of a final desperate struggle. No mention of a prolonged siege. The administrative heart of the civilization simply stops beating. This silence is not a lack of evidence. It is the evidence itself. It speaks to a catastrophe of incredible speed, an event so sudden and so total that it overwhelmed and erased the very systems designed to observe and document threats. The end did not announce itself. It simply arrived, leaving no time for a final entry in the ledger. The silence is the negative image of the event. It is the space the scribes could not, or would not, fill. They documented the aftermath in exhaustive detail. The dead, the sterile fields, the abandoned temples. But the moment of impact remains a perfect and absolute void in their records. It was a rupture so profound it could only be recorded by its consequences. The final arrangement of evidence on the table is no longer a collection of disparate artifacts. It is a schematic, a repeating blueprint for an unknown form of destruction. It begins with the steady pulse of a functioning state, followed by an absolute silence, and then a series of standardized reports detailing an impossible aftermath. This is not the pattern of myth. It is the cold, recurring signature of an event that has been filed away, its true nature waiting in the quiet for someone to recognize the sequence. The question remains, suspended in the dust of the archive. If the end of Ur was a physical event, observed and documented with such cold precision, then what cause did the scribes, the official record-keepers of the state, assign to it? The answer is not buried in metaphor or poetic allusion. It is stated plainly, with the same administrative finality as the rest of the report. It is presented as the source of the order, the top of a chain of command that ends in the sterile soil of Mesopotamia. The scribes did not record an accident of nature or an act of war. They recorded the execution of a formal decision. The texts state that the matter was settled in an assembly. This is the first detail of note. The cause was not a singular impulsive act of a lone deity. It was the result of a council, a gathering of authorities who deliberated and reached a verdict. The language used is that of a state proceeding, a formal body convened to address a matter of policy. The end of the world was not a moment of chaos, but the outcome of a structured, hierarchical process. The scribes are careful to document this procedure, as if citing the legal precedent for their own annihilation. At the head of this assembly, the records name an entity, Anu. The title ascribed to him is King of the Gods. This is not a description of his character or his motives. It is a statement of his position within the hierarchy, his ultimate executive authority. In the administrative framework of the Sumerian world, he occupies the highest office. His name appears in the report not as a personality to be feared or revered, but as the final signatory on the decree. He is the source from which the command originates. Alongside him, another authority is named Enlil. His title is given as Lord of all lands, a designation that defines the scope of his jurisdiction. If Anu is the supreme authority, Enlil is the chief administrator, the one whose domain is the tangible world below. The pairing is significant. It represents the dual authority of a remote sovereign and a direct governor, a complete chain of command from the highest conceptual level down to the management of the physical territory that was to be destroyed. The action they take is recorded with a stark, legalistic simplicity. The tablets state that Anu had uttered his word. Enlil had decreed the fate. These are not verbs of passion or violence. They are the verbs of legislation, of a verdict being handed down. It is the language a scribe would use to record a royal edict or the outcome of a court ruling. The cataclysm is thereby framed not as a battle or a natural disaster, but as the lawful and binding consequence of a sentence that has been formally passed. For a moment, the silence in the room seems to deepen. The implications of this framing are profound. A civilization of obsessive accountants, faced with an extinction-level event, chose to document it as a bureaucratic procedure. They did not write an epic of their struggle. They did not compose a theological treatise on their sins. They simply noted that a decision had been made by the relevant authorities, and that the consequences were now being implemented on the ground. The connection between this decision and the physical event is explicit. The imholu, the evil wind, is not an expression of their anger. It is the designated instrument for the execution of their decree. The texts present a clear, functional relationship. The assembly resolves, the decree is issued, and the wind is deployed to carry it out. The wind is an agent, a tool, a weapon system activated to achieve a specific, mandated outcome. It is a means to an end, not the end itself. What is absent from this record is as significant as what is present. There is no narrative of divine anger, no story of a cosmic dispute, no explanation of the crime that warranted such a punishment. The scribes provide the verdict, but not the details of the trial. The decision of the gods is presented as a remote, administrative fact, as opaque and unquestionable as the movement of the stars. The cause is cited, but it is not explained. This authority is defined by its distance. Anu and Enlil do not appear on the scene of the destruction. They are not described as walking through the ruins or witnessing the suffering of the people. Their presence is entirely confined to the formal setting of their assembly. They are an off-world, or at least off-site, board of directors whose resolution is communicated to the local branch office through a catastrophic, all-encompassing memorandum. Their detachment is a core feature of the report. This method of recording the incomprehensible becomes a pattern in itself. The scribes, when faced with a phenomenon that defied their understanding of the physical world, did not invent a complex myth. Instead, they defaulted to their own social and political structure. They attributed the event to a hierarchical authority, a decision-making body, and a formal decree. It was their way of imposing a familiar bureaucratic order onto an event that was, in its essence, pure chaos. This is the central, unsettling function of the gods in these specific records. They are not characters. They are a placeholder for a cause that could not be otherwise named. They are the ultimate because. When the scribe documents the bitter water and the withering plants, he is describing the what. When he names Anu and Enlil, he is providing the only who his system of knowledge would allow. It is the final line in a damage report, citing the authority under which the damage was sanctioned. The names themselves, Anu, Enlil, Nana, Ningal, begin to feel less like the names of gods and more like departmental designations within a vast, unseen administration. Their temples were not just places of worship. They were centers of economic and political power. When the lament notes that the rites in these temples have ceased, it is reporting the shutdown of critical state infrastructure. The gods were the heads of these departments, and their vacating of their residences signifies a total institutional collapse. This reframes the entire nature of the investigation. The mystery is no longer simply what happened to Ur in 2004 BCE. The mystery is why this event was remembered and recorded in this specific administrative format. Why was the language of bureaucracy chosen as the vessel for the memory of an apocalypse? It suggests that for the scribes, the most terrifying aspect of the event was not the destruction itself, but the fact that it was orderly, deliberate, and sanctioned from above. The others of the Sumerian record, therefore, do not offer a solution to the mystery. They are the mystery. They represent a causal layer that is both meticulously documented and fundamentally inaccessible. Their existence is noted with the same dispassionate clarity as the inventory of ruined temples, but their nature remains a perfect void. They are a function, a name in a report, a remote authority whose motives are never questioned or explained. They exist in the text only to authorize the impossible. They provide the formal justification for a wind that poisons rivers and a heat that vitrifies cities. They are the rational explanation for an irrational event, a way of filing the destruction of a world into the proper administrative category. They are not an answer. They are a signature at the bottom of the page. And so, the inquiry is displaced once more. It moves from the physical evidence in the soil to the textual evidence on the tablets, and now to the structure of the explanation itself. The presence of these administrative others does not close the file on the destruction of Ur. It opens a new one that questions the very nature of the reality the scribes were attempting to document. The focus shifts. It moves away from the tablet itself and onto the space it occupies within the archive. The researcher is no longer reading a line of text, but is instead observing the sequence, the order of things as they were catalogued. Here is the last economic record from the reign of Ibbi-Sin, and here, next to it, is the first tablet of the lament. Between them lies a sliver of empty space on the shelf, a physical representation of a temporal void. It is a silence measured not in years, but in the absence of a single crucial report that was never filed. This is not the silence of a forgotten history, but of an interrupted one. The archaeological record mirrors this archival gap. In the deep trenches cut into the mound of Ur, the strata of the city are laid bare, like the pages of a book. Layer upon layer of compacted earth, brick, and pottery tell a story of continuous occupation. The early dynastic period, the Akkadian, the Gutian, and then the dense, prosperous layer of the Third Dynasty. A civilization building upon itself, century after century, in an unbroken sequence. And then the sequence breaks. The archaeological stratum corresponding to the end of the Third Dynasty is not a gradual decline. It is a sharp, definitive line in the earth. It is a thin, dark band of ash and sterile soil, a geological punctuation mark. Above it, the signs of life are different, poorer, hesitant. Below it, the evidence of a complex functioning state is abundant. The line itself, the moment of transition, is silent. It contains no record of a prolonged struggle. It is the scar of an event that happened between one breath and the next. One can almost feel the dry desert wind moving across the exposed cut, catching the fine dust from that thin, dark layer. It is the dust of a moment that was never documented, only survived. A moment whose nature must be inferred from the profound and absolute silence that follows it. The absence is not a lack of evidence, it is a specific kind of evidence in itself. To understand the depth of this silence, one must first appreciate the noise that preceded it. The archives of the Third Dynasty of Ur are one of the largest bodies of administrative text from the ancient world. Tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered. They document tax receipts, land sales, temple offerings, legal judgments, and the daily distribution of barley rations to state workers. It was a civilization that ran on ink, or rather, on the impressions a stylus makes in wet clay. They recorded everything. This obsessive documentation is what makes the void so jarring. This was not a pre-literate society whose history is lost to time. This was a hyper-literate, bureaucratic superstate that believed in the power of the written word to maintain cosmic and social order. For such a system to fall silent, the event that caused it must have been of a nature that overwhelmed the very mechanism of recording. It was a failure not just of the state, but of the state's ability to observe and report on its own demise. The last known administrative tablet from Ur is mundane, almost painfully so. It is a receipt for a consignment of animal hides, dated to the final years of King Ibbi-Sin. It is a document of a world that believes it has a future, a world where ledgers must be balanced and inventories must be kept. It is the final, steady pulse of a bureaucracy functioning as it always had, unaware that it is the last entry that will ever be made in that particular ledger. Take a moment to register this interval. the space between that final, ordinary receipt and the first, cold line of the lament. It is in this unwritten space that the event itself resides, a silence that contains the entirety of the catastrophe. This is not a case of a library being burned or records being selectively destroyed by a conqueror. The administrative tablets from before the event were preserved, baked hard in the destruction. The lament tablets, written after the event, were also preserved. What is missing is the connective tissue, the report from the moment of impact. The scribes, the ultimate functionaries of the state, documented the aftermath with chilling precision, but they left the central column of the report, the description of the event itself, perfectly, unnervingly blank. The silence echoes in the king lists, the official chronologies compiled by later generations of scribes. These documents were the backbone of Mesopotamian history, establishing the legitimate succession of rulers. The Sumerian king list notes the end of the dynasty of Ur. It records the name of its last king, Ibi-Sin, and the length of his reign. Then, without explanation for the rupture, it simply begins the next section with the first king of the dynasty of Isin. The fall of an entire civilization is treated as a simple line break. The scribes who came after, the inheritors of this broken world, seem to have understood this silence as a necessary part of the record. They do not attempt to fill it in with a narrative of a great war or a heroic last stand. They simply register the change in dynasty. The cataclysm that ended the Sumerian age is not a story to be told. It is a boundary condition, a given fact of their new reality, as fundamental and unexplained as the rising of the sun. This quiet acceptance of the void suggests a deliberate choice, a collective, inherited decision to not attempt a description. It is a silence that feels curated, as if the memory of the event was actively cordoned off. The scribes could speak of the world before, and they could speak of the world after, but the mechanism of the transition itself was left unspoken, locked away behind a wall of administrative procedure and divine decree. The void becomes, then, an active force. It is the central character in the final days of Ur. It is an antagonist made of pure absence. It is the unwritten report, the missing battle chronicle, the silent geological layer. It is an erasure so complete that it has shaped the very way the memory of the event was preserved. The story is not about what happened, but about what could not be said. This is in stark contrast to the records of other fallen cities in the ancient Near East. When the Hittites sacked Babylon, they boasted of it in their annals. When the Assyrians conquered a rival, they carved the details of their siege into stone reliefs for all to see. Conquest was a source of prestige, a thing to be documented and celebrated. The destruction of Ur has no such chronicle from the victor's side. Even the Elamites, the neighboring civilization traditionally credited with delivering the final blow to a weakened Ur, left no triumphal record of this specific world-ending event. Their texts speak of conflicts and raids along the border, the normal friction between neighboring powers. But there is no Elamite inscription that claims responsibility for poisoning the rivers of Sumeria and rendering its fields sterile for generations. The silence is bilateral. The air in the archive grows thin. The weight of what is not there has become greater than the weight of what is. The investigation has followed the trail of evidence through texts and soil samples, only to arrive at a perfect wall of absence, a void that is meticulously framed by the records of what came before and what came after. This silence is, perhaps, the most articulate part of the entire record. It testifies to an event that fell so far outside the Sumerian conceptual framework of warfare, natural disaster, or divine anger that they possessed no language for it. Their system could not process it. They had no forms to fill out for the sudden and permanent negation of their world. The screen displays a simple timeline. A dense, bright line of thousands of data points charts the administrative records of the third dynasty of Ur. For over a century, the data is continuous. Then, the line stops. A clean, sharp break. After this dark gap, A single, isolated point appears on the other side. It is the lament. The image holds on the empty space between them, the silent, unwritten history of the end of a world. The evidence is no longer a collection of fragments. The tablets from Ur and Eridu, the soil analysis from Nippur, the maps of the synchronous destruction layers, they have ceased to be individual clues in a cold case. Arranged here, under the patient light of the archive, they have fused into a single, coherent object, a unified and internally consistent account of an event that should not have happened. The consistency itself is now the primary artifact. The problem is no longer that the story is strange, but that the story is the same, no matter which ruined city it is told in. The pattern is too perfect. This coherence shifts the ground of the entire inquiry. A series of local myths, passed down through generations, would have diverged. They would have acquired local color, different details, unique interpretations. But these are not myths. They are field reports, and they corroborate one another with the dispassionate precision of scientific observation. The vector of the wind, the chemical change in the water, the biological replacement in the soil. The data points are identical. The laments are not a collection of poems about the fall of cities. They are the collected testimony from multiple independent witnesses to a single, regional, and instantaneous event. For a moment, the sheer scale of this implication settles. This was not the piecemeal decline of a civilization, worn down by war and climate change. It was a shutdown, a coordinated, systemic termination event that erased the operational capacity of an entire culture in a single undocumented moment. The scribes were not mourning the slow death of their world. They were taking inventory in the immediate aftermath of its execution. The precision of their records is the precision of a coroner's report, noting the state of the body, not the narrative of the life that was lost. And the nature of that report is perhaps the most alien detail of all. The scribes did not invent a monster or a demon to personify the destructive force. They did not compose an epic of a final, heroic battle against an overwhelming foe. They defaulted to the only system of order they knew: bureaucracy. They filed the end of their world as if it were a catastrophic failure in the supply chain, a problem to be documented and reported up the administrative ladder. The choice of genre, the lament as a standardized damage report, is itself a critical piece of evidence. This suggests something profound about their perception of the event. To record a cataclysm in the language of a ledger is to imply that the event itself possessed a kind of administrative logic. It was not a chaotic act of nature, but a structured, deliberate process with a clear, albeit incomprehensible, source of authority. Their dispassionate tone is not a sign of emotional emptiness. It is the sound of a functionary staying within the formal constraints of their professional duty, even as their world dissolves around them. They are not storytellers. They are the last active node of a system, filing a final report before going dark. This reframes their role entirely. We see them not as poets struggling to express the ineffable, but as civil servants faced with a terminal anomaly. Their job was to observe, record, and categorize. And when faced with an event that fit no existing category, they placed it in the only one that could contain it: a formal decree from the highest imaginable authority. It was a rational response to an irrational reality, an attempt to impose the familiar order of their state bureaucracy onto an event that originated outside of it. The low, steady light catches the edge of a tablet, illuminating the dense, wedge-shaped marks. There is a profound stillness here, a sense that the air itself has not moved since these objects were first brought out of the earth. The very survival of these records is a paradox. They are the meticulous documentation of a force that should have erased the recorders, the records, and the memory of the system that produced them. Their existence is a quiet, persistent contradiction. The divine assembly, then, ceases to be a theological explanation. It becomes a procedural one. It is the scribe's best attempt to name the source of the directive. Anu and Enlil are not figures of faith in this context. They are the names entered into the authorized by field at the bottom of the form. They represent a causal agency that was perceived as intelligent, hierarchical, and remote, an off-world board of directors that had passed a resolution, of which the evil wind and the scorching heat were merely the physical implementation. And the silence, the void in the records, where the moment of impact should be, is also reframed. It is not a failure to remember. It is a measurement. It is the signature of a force that moves faster than the speed of bureaucracy, a phenomenon so swift and so total that it preempts the very mechanism of observation. The gap between the last receipt for animal hides and the first line of the lament is the recorded duration of the event itself, a history measured in the space between two tablets on a shelf. There is a deep and unsettling quiet that comes with this realization. The history of the end of Sumer is not a story of kings and armies. It is a collection of sterile paperwork. It is an archive of audits and inventories that document the methodical disassembly of a world. The true mystery is not the weapon that was used, but the administrative coldness with which its effects were recorded. It feels less like a tragedy and more like a procedure. This pattern of memory, this specific method for recording the incomprehensible, is the final and most disturbing artifact, a detailed physical description of impossible effects, attributed to a remote administrative decision, with a profound silence at the core where the event itself should be. This structure is more than just a historical anomaly. It begins to look like a template, a standardized format for remembering a certain type of event that falls outside the normal spectrum of human experience. To continue with this archive is to acknowledge that some histories are not linear narratives, but recurring patterns that echo across millennia. It is to keep this file open, not in the hope of finding a final answer, but to be present when the next record in the sequence is recognized, because the echo of this template is undeniable. Later traditions, in nearby lands, would tell stories of cities destroyed by a divine verdict. The account of Sodom and Gomorrah is not the same story, but it is built on the same skeletal framework. A formal decision from a remote authority, a destructive force that descends from the sky, a burning sulfur that sounds like a memory of the scorching heat, and a land left permanently sterile and uninhabitable. The connection is not a matter of one story borrowing from another. It is a question of a shared structure of memory. It suggests the existence of a category of cataclysm, so far outside the conventional that it can only be processed and preserved in this specific, fractured way, as a technical report of the aftermath, filed under the name of a distant and inaccessible authority. The memory is not of a war or a storm, but of a sentence being carried out. The implication, then, expands beyond the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. The real disturbance is not what happened to the Sumerians in 2004 BCE. It is the possibility that our understanding of the past is built upon a foundational omission. That history, as we have written it, has no category for events of this nature. It is a system of knowledge that cannot account for a phenomenon that leaves behind not a story, but a cold, administrative scar, and a perfect, deafening silence. The timeline on the screen remains. The dense line of a functioning civilization. The sharp, clean break. The void. And then, the single point of the lament on the other side. This is not the record of a forgotten chapter of human history. It is the record of a chapter that could not be written, because the event it would have described consumed the authors, the language, and the very world in which a record could be made. We are not looking at a memory of the event. We are looking at the memory of its wake. The museum is quiet now. The crowds have gone. All that remains is the low, steady hum of the climate control, a modern attempt to hold time at bay. Under a single beam of directed light, it rests. The tablet from Ur, 4,000 years old, a small rectangle of baked clay, covered in a dense grid of wedge-shaped marks. It is no longer just an artifact. It has become a repository for a question that has no answer, only an echo. It is an object that has absorbed all the silence that surrounds it and holds it there, under the glass. Its silence is different from that of the other objects in this hall. A shattered pot speaks of use, of a life lived. A king's statue speaks of power, however fleeting. But this tablet speaks only of a procedure. It is the final form, filed away in a bureaucracy that ceased to exist the moment the report was complete. It does not cry out in grief. It does not boast of a heroic struggle. It simply is. A cold, factual statement of an impossible event, preserved in the earth like a fossilized bone from an animal that should never have existed. One can almost feel the presence of the scribe, not as a ghost, but as a persistent, structural intelligence. His hand did not tremble. His purpose did not waver. He was a servant of the record, and his final duty was to document the suspension of all other duties. He recorded the end of the world with the same dispassionate clarity he would have used to record a shipment of grain, because for him, they were the same thing. A transaction within a system. The system had failed. The transaction was logged. The tablet remains. The civilization that created it is a layer of dust under the Iraqi sun. This is the final and perhaps most profound dislocation. The memory of the event, encoded in this hardened mud, has proven more durable than the temples of brick and the armies of men. The report outlasted the administration it was filed for. It is a message in a bottle, sent from a world that had no time to describe the storm that sank the ship, only the coordinates of where it went down. Outside these quiet walls, the wind moves across the southern plain. It is a real wind, carrying sand and the scent of the dry earth. It whispers over the low, eroded mounds that were once the cities of Sumer, Ur, Eridu, Nippur. They are quiet now, their names little more than labels on an archaeological map. The wind finds the cracks in the ruined walls, the empty doorways of buried houses. It is a natural force, a simple movement of air. And yet, here, it feels like a faint, distant memory of something else. At night, the great ziggurat of Ur stands against a field of stars that is largely unchanged from the one the Sumerians saw. It is a stark silhouette, a man-made mountain of order and belief, now a monument to a fracture in that order. It was built to bridge the gap between the earth and the heavens, a point of contact with the divine administration. Now, it stands as a silent witness to a time when a verdict was passed down from that remote authority, a verdict from which there was no appeal. The scribes who watched these same stars believed they were observing the workings of a perfect, cyclical machine. The movements of the heavens were reflected in the rhythms of the state, the cycles of the harvest, the rituals of the temple. They saw a world bound by cosmic law. What, then, did it mean to see that law so utterly and irrevocably broken? To witness an event that did not fit anywhere in their meticulous catalogues of what was possible? The question has not been resolved. It has only been clarified. It has expanded from the strange wording of a single line in a lament to the unnerving consistency of a dozen such laments. It is no longer about what happened to a single city. It is about a pattern of memory, a specific, recurring template for how to record an event that lies beyond the horizon of conventional human experience. A memory of a sentence, not a battle. And at the heart of that memory is the void, the perfect, curated silence in the records. It is not a forgotten detail. It is the central feature. It is the negative space around which the entire account is constructed. The scribes built a wall of meticulous factual observation around a core that they could not or would not describe. That silence remains. It is the sound of a door being shut on a reality that was too vast or too terrible to be faced directly. To have remained here in this quiet is to have stood watch with the record. It is not an act of discovery, but of witnessing. It is to acknowledge that some histories are not narratives to be concluded, but frequencies to be listened for. It is to accept that the most profound truths are sometimes found not in what is said, but in the structure of the silence that surrounds it. You have not been given an answer. You have been given the evidence and the weight of the question it creates. The light in the display case is low and warm, designed to preserve the clay from which the tablet was made. It illuminates the marks, but it cannot penetrate them. The record is visible, but it is not transparent. It remains opaque, a 4,000-year-old piece of official paperwork from an administration whose business we can no longer comprehend. We can translate the words, but we can no longer access the context that gave them meaning. The tiny, wedge-shaped impressions catch the light, each one a deliberate act, a moment of pressure applied by a human hand to a piece of wet clay. They form words, sentences, a report. But seen from this distance, they also look like something else. A code, a sequence of data, recording the physical parameters of an event that shattered the framework of the language used to describe it. A message that has been delivered, but not yet understood. Slowly, the lights in the hall begin to dim, one by one. The beam on the tablet is the last to go out, and for a final moment it seems to float alone in the darkness. Then it, too, is gone. The room is returned to a complete and perfect black. But the object is still there, waiting. A quiet, persistent fact, sleeping in the dark of the archive, its report filed, its vigil kept.